The Meta situation is actually somehow worse. For those that don't know anything about Meta, Facebook, or the Instagram situation, let me just give you a quick speed run of its history. Facebook went super hard in VR, then found out, VR is not actually where it's at. It's all about AI. And then decided that it's going to fire roughly 10% of its company or 8,000 employees and focus super hard on AI. And a part of that focusing super hard on AI, it's going to record everybody's desktop and everything you do and then feed that to the AI. Not only that, it's going to create a new organization, Applied AI, where it's going to put approximately 10% of the company into it, where they're going to help train and make the next generation of AI. Of course, during all this, Zuckerberg on a phone call called everybody super highly intelligent, the most high IQ people in the valley. And then after saying all of that, said that the reason why they're recording your desktop but not telling you why is because it's for your own best interest.
Not strategically in your interest for us to communicate everything like in all the detail that we normally would on this.
But now the internals are coming out. Employees are coming forward and speaking about what's actually going on inside of Facebook. It does not look good. It does not look good at all. In fact, this is somehow the least bad thing coming out of Facebook, which is they just shipped JSON that's not even parsable to production. The golden age of slop has arrived, and it's happening right now live at Facebook. But the internal employee morale is even worse than this. Like, imagine working at a place where they're like, you ain't got time to set up a CI/CD pipeline to make sure JSON parses. That's where we're at. But first, I'd like to say a quick thank you to the sponsors. Hey, is that HTTP? Get that out of here. That's not how we order coffee. We order coffee via sshterminal.shop. Yeah, you want a real experience? You want real coffee? You want awesome subscriptions so you never have to remember again? Oh, you want exclusive blends with exclusive coffee and exclusive. It is absolutely a total mess. So now that little quote, that little line comes from actually a live town hall in which thousands of employees were all in a single meeting video call with some presenters going over some sort of information. Someone just joins, flips on a mic, goes hot mic, and is just lets out a 4-letter rant for the ages, finishing up with, hey, you know the Meta AI executives? Yo, go tell him he's a piece of shit. Imagine being in that call, because the presenters, it even says one of the presenters covered their faces with their hands, according to a witness. Of course, you know why they were covering their faces. They were laughing, okay? You can't be showing all the people that you're laughing at some profanity-laced AI rant, especially when you're the one presenting. You just gotta cover your face and pretend it doesn't happen. So what's happening is, since April, a new org has been formed in which about 6,500 employees have joined. Now, they have joined in waves, and it's described as this: the organization has grown in batches since early April. It's crazy to watch people experience the shock of it as each wave comes in. So this organization is not necessarily known for being fantastic. So what's actually happening is that they're taking all of their talented engineers, right? These really top talented, the best, the most intelligent engineers that are possible at Facebook, and they're assembling them into this team. And they're given about 2 tasks per week to finish. And these tasks, they involve generating complex software coding problems to help AI scientists better train and evaluate the performance of the latest frontier models, meaning they're not actually solving or building anything real. They're coming up with toy examples.
You either spend hours modeling them in Blender. I generated them using Trippo. You can generate a 3D.
We've been seeing all of these horrors in this country, but then again, this willingness of everyday people to really take a stand.
Well, I mean, one, at this present moment with the escalating neo-fascist sensibilities and neo-fascist policies, tied not just to the gangster Trump administration, but of course, big tech and Wall Street, Silicon Valley, big military, industrial interests behind him. And he's trying to somehow seduce enough people to allow them to stay in office. I always understand this against a larger backdrop, though, brother. I think most of human history is a history of organized greed and weaponized hatred and institutionalized cruelty, routinized indifference toward the plight of everyday people. And those wonderful moments of interruption, which are not just moments of resistance, but they're moments of remembrance of resistance that give us a reverence of something bigger than our egos and our tribe, that connect us to the larger issues of humanity as a species and even beyond. And so, in that sense, I say to myself, well, you know, Trumpism and neo-fascism, given the legacies of white supremacy and predatory capitalism and patriarchy and homophobia and transphobia, it's not new at all. The thing is precisely what you said. How do we muster integrity, courage, decency, both as persons, and then connected to moments of the movements of solidarity across region, across color, across national boundaries? And that's always been an uphill battle, brother, as long as we human beings have been around. So the good news is there's always a cloud of witnesses every generation who are willing to stand up with courage and integrity and tell the truth about the suffering of the poor and working peoples. And most importantly, don't have a brand. It's not just a market strategy at all. They have a cause. They're willing to live for it. They're willing to die for it. And I know you got figures in your book who exemplify what I'm talking about in Texas, man.
No, I mean, you've seen, it is incredible to see the bravery of a lot of folks and also take inspiration from people who were doing the right thing, suffered the ultimate cost, but just seeing over and over and over throughout human history, American history, you know, the willingness of people to take on systems that felt like they were unbeatable, right? You talk about Jim Crow in the South, it felt like it was unbeatable. You talk about the power of the railroads and the monopolies, they felt like they were unbeatable. But just simple folk organizing together, challenging these kind of systems, and they don't always win. But it is something that's like, man, that was a hard time to organize. It's tough to organize today, but that was a very hard time to organize, and you should take some inspiration from it.
And you can imagine Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass trying to organize dignified Africans enslaved by a barbaric American slavery system. And yet they persisted, they persevered, but they had a certain kind of character, brother. You know, they decided, this is the kind of human being I want to be and the kind of movements I want to be a part of. And if I have the chance of a snowball in hell, I'm still giving my all.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, let's talk about a little bit of this current moment, though. I mean, this is the second Trump administration, and the first one was horrible. I wonder, you know, if you feel like the lessons that are needed to be learned are being learned right now, because obviously there's tremendous resistance to Trump. But I do worry that, you know, there is such a focus on him that people are forgetting the systems that put him into place, you know, originally, and that he's built off of. You know, you look at ICE, these, you know, were systems that preceded him. You saw the Democratic Party play a big role in expanding their authority and power. You see the illegality that Trump acts with. Well, that's a part of, you know, this American system that we've been living under, where presidents continuously challenge the Constitution, challenge the democracy. So I'm just, you know, wanted to hear your thoughts on kind of keeping our eye on the ball on the longer term as we directly oppose what we're seeing from Trump and this right-wing movement.
Well, I think the last thing we want to do is to fetishize any one individual. To fetishize Trump and describe to him magical powers as if somehow, if he were not here, the same social and historical and cultural forces would not be operating, is highly problematic. Now, Trump plays a role. There's no doubt about that, tied to the MAGA movement and so on. But there is no Donald Trump in the White House without those major monopolies and oligopolies, and at the same time, the massive complicity of professional managerial slices of the professional managerial class, the lawyers, the college presidents, the professors, the doctors, the pharmacists, the churches. There's no Trump with.
What happened in a medieval village when one of the villagers wasn't like everyone else? I think we assume that person would get exiled or accused of witchcraft, but that actually isn't what happened. Turns out people in the Middle Ages understood neurodivergence, even if they didn't necessarily have a specific term for it. The actual term autism was originally coined by the German psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler in 1911, but it wasn't until the early 1940s that it was conceptualized as a distinct neurodevelopmental condition. That's not to say it hasn't always existed though. I think it's important to note here that we can't go back in time and diagnose anybody from the past with anything specifically. You can see why that would be pretty irresponsible, but what we can do is look at individuals who displayed traits we now associate with the autism spectrum and see how people 1,000 years ago understood them. A lot of that understanding happened in a religious context, but this was medieval Europe, so literally everything happened in a religious context. Let's meet Brother Juniper. We have no idea when he was born, but he died in 1258, and he's known for being one of the OG companions of maybe the most famous figure of the whole Middle Ages, Saint Francis of Assisi. Because he was tight with Francis, we actually have a ton of details about his life, most of which were recorded in the early Franciscan text, The Little Flowers of Saint Francis. When you start reading about Brother Juniper's personality, it starts to sound kind of familiar. He was known for, let's see here, taking everything extremely literally, having an absolute lack of social awareness, and, I quote, a complete absence of malice or guile. Juniper sounds like the sweetest guy ever, but just like today, if you're different from everybody else, it obviously makes you stick out like a sore thumb. Thankfully, he was friends with one of the holiest men who ever lived, and Saint Francis protected him kind of like an older brother. Francis actually famously said about Juniper, "Would to God, my brethren, that I had a whole forest of such junipers." Do you get the play on words there? Like his name is Juniper, but also juniper trees, forest. Pretty clever. Anyway, you've probably heard of the monastic vow of poverty, and not every monastic order takes this vow, but the Franciscans do. This caused some problems for Juniper. That's because he took the vow so literally that he would give away his clothes to anybody that asked him, to the point that he actually had to be ordered by his superior to stop walking around naked. Even then, there was a time where a beggar asked him for help, and Juniper replied, "My superior has forbidden me from giving you my tunic, but if you tear it off my back, I won't stop you." There are tons of stories like this, including one that involves pig's feet and another where Juniper decided one day that he wasn't going to speak for 6 months, and then he didn't. He did not say a word for 6 months. Overall, he was beloved by his brothers, even though he was so different from them, and he is sometimes referred to as the renowned jester of the Lord. Ugh, that doesn't sound so good. That actually sounds kind of insulting. The weird thing is that it wasn't at all. It's kind of this strange example of how definitions change over time. Brother Juniper was what was known in the Middle Ages as a fool for Christ. Let's zero in on this because the whole concept might be one of the earliest examples of autism spectrum traits that we can find in medieval history. Now, in the modern sense, fool has a pretty negative connotation, like I pity the fool, that sort of thing.
No, I don't hate Balboa, but I pity the fool, and I will destroy any man who tries to take what I got.
But foolishness for Christ in the Middle Ages was different. The idea originally stems from the New Testament, where foolishness is this total rejection of worldly cares and this obsessive desire to imitate Christ. In 1 Corinthians 4:10, St. Paul writes, "We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are honorable, but we are despised." So the basic idea is, hey, there's this guy in the village who walks around with no shoes and prays to himself constantly. We might typically think of that behavior as foolish, but he's actually a fool for Christ. So this isn't strange behavior, it's holy behavior. Even then, I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture that holy men who exhibited potentially neurodivergent traits were all venerated or something, because that certainly was not always the case. Before exploring these different medieval life paths, want to unlock your own epic ancestral story for just $19? Use my code MIND19. I partnered with MyHeritage, and swabbing my cheek took just 5 seconds. The results absolutely blew me away. All right, I just got my MyHeritage DNA results back. Let's see what I got. Origins feature IQ breaking radio existed. Plus, they're getting an insane bundle. For just $19, you get the kit, a 30-day free trial, and free shipping. Let's meet Nicholas the Pilgrim, also known as St. Nicholas of Trani, who was born in Greece in the early 11th century. It was apparent to pretty much everyone that Nicholas was different from birth, and at age 8, he suddenly started repeating the Greek phrase Kyrie eleison over and over again, which means Lord have mercy. He was doing this all day, every day, and it wasn't like a thing where he was whispering to himself. It was basically something that he was shouting constantly. Nowadays, we know this is a manifestation of what's called echolalia, or the repetition of words or phrases, and Nicholas was clearly using it as a vocal stim. His daily routine was super rigid too, and he never deviated from it. He would walk around carrying a heavy wooden cross, shouting his prayer. It was this intense kind of all-consuming hyperfixation that became his whole life. One of the most defining characteristics of autism is an heavy, super rigid, and Nicholas was what's called something that he on over and over, and in the 11th century. It was apparent to pretty much everyone that Nicholas was different from birth, and at age 8, he suddenly started repeating the Greek phrase Kyrie eleison over and over again, which means Lord have mercy. He was doing this all day, every day, and it wasn't like a thing where he was whispering to himself. It was basically something that he was shouting constantly. Nowadays, we know this is a manifestation of what's called echolalia, or the repetition of words or phrases, and Nicholas was clearly using it as a vocal stim. His daily routine was super rigid too, and he never deviated from it. He would walk around carrying a heavy wooden cross, shouting his prayer. It was this intense kind of all-consuming hyperfixation that became his whole life. One of the most defining characteristics of autism is an intense resistance to having a comforting routine disrupted, even in the face of immense distress or danger. People in Nicholas's life tried everything to get him to stop chanting. His mom beat him, local bishops found him so annoying that they cast him out of the monastery. When he entered the city of Taranto, the local bishop was so pissed off by the noise he was making that he ordered a crowd to rough Nicholas up. There's no happy ending here, unfortunately, and Nicholas died at 19, most likely from a combination of exhaustion and exposure to the elements due to his homelessness. The world can be a very cruel and nasty place, and I guess the only consolation is that just 4 years after his death, the church recognized that his hyperfixation was actually a rejection of worldly logic and a singular devotion to Christ. Nicholas was canonized by Pope Urban II in 1098, and today the gorgeous Cathedral of Trani in Italy stands as a monument to his memory, and he's actually buried beneath it. I don't know, that's nice I guess, but it doesn't really fill me with the warm and fuzzies. It's like people didn't even want to see this guy as human until he died tragically, and then they felt bad and changed their minds. I actually kind of feel like Nicholas and Juniper are two sides of the same coin, except Juniper was lucky enough to get in with a group of fellas who recognized the beauty in his different nature and accepted him for who he was. But I want to meet somebody else totally different, a medieval personality who perhaps exhibited some similar traits but lived a totally different life. Some of you have probably been sitting there fuming, wondering why I haven't mentioned a certain German abbess yet, so let's talk about her. Meet Hildegard von Bingen, maybe one of the most impressive human beings who has ever lived. If someone like Brother Juniper represents the vulnerable, hyper-literal innocent who needed a protective community shield, Hildegard is more like the high-functioning, fiercely independent systematizer, maybe hyper-systematizer. She was an abbess, a writer, a philosopher, a composer, a mystic, a visionary, a medical practitioner. I mean, literally name a thing, I would bet good money that Hildegard did it and was incredible at it. Okay, no, she could not dunk a basketball from the free throw line, but I bet if you gave her a ball in enough time, she would figure out how to do it. Basically, this woman was a neurodivergent powerhouse who bent the entire medieval establishment to her will. Oh, you want an example? How about the fact that she came up with her own language, which was called the lingua ignota, Latin for unknown language. Just the language itself wasn't impressive enough, so she also invented a completely custom 23-letter alphabet. No, it wasn't just random gibberish. My parents will have to confirm, but I'm pretty sure I tried to come up with my own version of Pig Latin as a kid, and it was just total nonsense. Not for Hildegard. This was a structured, secret glossary of over 1,000 words, most of which were related to medical or religious or sometimes even botanical terms. The modern definition of her would be a conlanger, or a constructed language creator, which is basically an exhibition of deep hyperfixation on linguistic classification and cryptography. Did I mention that she experienced synesthesia? Yeah, she was famous during her lifetime for these intense visions she had, But unlike other medieval mystics, the visions didn't happen while she was asleep and dreaming or after she had worked herself into a sort of trance state. They actually happened while she was wide awake. It's difficult to understand exactly what she was experiencing, but Hildegard describes the visions as this kind of overwhelming, brilliant blast of sensory input that she called the living light. From what she wrote, it seems like her mind kind of cross-wired these intense sensory experiences with the complex theological and scientific concepts that were bouncing around in her head all day. I mean, this was a woman who literally wrote music where the structural geometry of the universe matched the literal intervals of the chords. This highly visual, but also highly organized way of thinking, like, I don't know, mapping the entire cosmos into interconnected geometric diagrams, is incredibly common among visual thinkers on the spectrum, usually those who exhibit the autistic genius profile. Now, Hildegard was of course a woman living in the Middle Ages, so at first the fellas tried to be one of the most impressive human beings who has ever lived. If someone like Brother Juniper represents the vulnerable, hyper-literal innocent who needed a protective community shield, Hildegard is more like the high-functioning, fiercely independent systematizer, maybe hyper-systematizer. She was an abbess, a writer, a philosopher, a composer, a mystic, a visionary, a medical practitioner. I mean, literally name a thing, I would bet good money.
Igor is the coach, so he bought a document.
German Benedictine abbess and polymath, active as a writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, visionary, and as a medieval writer and practitioner of the Catholic Church during the High Medieval Ages. Middle Ages, holy shit. She is one of the best-known composers of sacred monophony, as well as the most recorded in modern history. A number of scholars have considered her to be the founder of scientific natural history in Germany. Hildegard's Covenant at Disibodenberg was a pretty building. It's founded in the... Oh my god, there's so many old words in here. Eibingen in 1165. Hildegard wrote theological, botanical, and medicinal works, as well as letters, hymns, and antiphons for the liturgy. She wrote poems and supervised miniature illuminations in the Rupertsberg manuscript for her first work, Scavius. Let's see. Wow, pretty. There are more surviving chants by Hildegard than by any other composer in the entire Middle Ages. She is one of the few known composers to have written both music and the words. One of her works, written both the music and the words. One of her works, the Odo Vitutum, is an early example of liturgical drama and arguably the oldest surviving morality play. She is noted for the invention of a constructed language known as lingua ignotica.
What happened in a medieval village? What happened in a medieval village who has ever lived? If someone like Brother Juniper represents the vulnerable, hyper-literal innocent who needed a protective community shield, Hildegard is more like the high-functioning, fiercely independent systematizer, maybe hyper-systematizer. She was an abbess, a writer, a philosopher, a composer, a mystic, a visionary, a medical practitioner. I mean, literally name a thing, I would bet good money that Hildegard did it and was incredible at it. Okay, no, she could not dunk a basketball from the free throw line, but I bet if you gave her a ball and enough time, she would figure out how to do it. Basically, this woman was a neurodivergent powerhouse who bent the entire medieval establishment to her will. Oh, you want an example? How about the fact that she came up with her own language, which was called the lingua ignota, Latin for unknown language. Just the language itself wasn't impressive enough, so she also invented a completely custom 23-letter alphabet. No, it wasn't just random gibberish. My parents will have to confirm, but I'm pretty sure I tried to come up with my own version of Pig Latin as a kid, and it was just total nonsense. Not for Hildegard. This was a structured, secret glossary of over 1,000 words, most of which were related to medical or religious or sometimes even botanical terms. The modern definition of her would be a conlanger or a constructed language creator, which is basically an exhibition of deep hyperfixation on linguistic classification and cryptography. Did I mention that she experienced synesthesia? Yeah, she was famous during her lifetime for these intense visions she had, but unlike other medieval mystics, the visions didn't happen while she was asleep and dreaming or after she had worked herself into a sort of trance state. They actually happened while she was wide awake. It's difficult to understand exactly what she was experiencing, but Hildegard describes the visions as this kind of overwhelming, brilliant blast of sensory input that she called the living light. From what she wrote, it seems like her mind kind of cross-wired these intense sensory experiences with the complex theological and scientific concepts that were bouncing around in her head all day. I mean, this was a woman who literally wrote music where the structural geometry of the universe matched the literal intervals of the chords. This highly visual, but also highly organized way of thinking, like, I don't know, mapping the entire cosmos into interconnected geometric diagrams, is incredibly common among visual thinkers on the spectrum, usually those who exhibit the autistic genius profile. Now, Hildegard was of course a woman living in the Middle Ages, so at first the fellas tried to box her in, the medieval establishment was a little put off by all this, but the trick was to present your cognitive differences as a direct, unmediated transmission from God, basically to put a label on it before other people could accuse you of being crazy or demon-possessed or something. This is exactly what Hildegard did, and so instead of treating her with pity or being afraid of her, the medieval community treated her with this immense awe and even kind of like a political deference. Pope Eugenius III actually read her writings out loud to a synod of bishops and gave her official papal approval for everything she was getting up to. For those not well versed in medieval Catholicism, once you got papal approval, you were untouchable. Hildegard had arrived, baby, and she had more than a few things she wanted to get done. So she founded not one, but 2 independent convents. She went on a massive public preaching tour across Germany. She wrote letters to emperors, most famously to Frederick Barbarossa, and also to popes, and in the letters she would scold them for their bad behavior. So I guess if we take a step back, what we're seeing here is that the medieval approach to neurodivergent traits wasn't really a one-size-fits-all model. It kind of depended on the individual. If you were more of a natural fool, you might get treated with lighthearted indulgence, or you might get beat up. If your unique brain structure manifested as a systematic, hyper-productive genius, medieval society wouldn't just accommodate you, you would be elevated to the absolute highest tiers of spiritual and intellectual authority. Maybe you've also heard of Bernard of Clairvaux, more commonly known as Saint Bernard. I'm so deep off in medieval history at this point that I sometimes can't tell if certain people are just household names to me or if everyone knows them, but anyway, Saint Bernard. Basically, through pure force of personality, he rose from leadership of a small French monastery to the Catholic conscience of medieval Europe in the 12th century. He was this larger-than-life figure who, just like Hildegard, became an advisor to popes and kings and one of the most significant religious figures of the entire Middle Ages. He also preached and supported the disastrous Second Crusade, but it says something about how elevated his status was that even a catastrophe like that didn't really put a dent in his public sway. Bernard also displayed behaviors that we would today label as profound sensory detachment and monomaniacal hyperfixation, and also, just like Hildegard, he turned these into his superpowers. There was the so-called Lake Geneva incident, where Bernard spent an entire day riding a horse along the shores of Lake Geneva with a group of companions. I've never been to Lake Geneva, but if you look at pictures, it is massive, it's stunning, and most importantly, it seems pretty impossible to miss. That evening, when his traveling companions started discussing the beauty of the lake that they had spent the whole day riding next to, Bernard looked at them in total confusion and asked, "What lake?" A chronicler also once noted that he lived in a monastic cell for over a year and couldn't remember if the ceiling was vaulted or flat or whether the room even had windows. He basically didn't process physical environments if they didn't align with his internal focus. Bernard also struggled a lot with sensory overload, to the point that he overhauled the whole monastic system as part of his need for sensory minimalism. At the time, the dominant monastic order was Cluny, which was all about massive, ornate churches filled with stained glass, gold statues, intricate stone carvings, really loud, complex music, the whole kit and caboodle. To Bernard, or anyone with sensory difficulties, it was kind of a complete nightmare. So he championed the Cistercian order, which stripped all of that stuff away. He banned stained glass and statues and made sure the churches were all about plain walls and absolute silence. Now, Bernard had other theological reasons for this as well, and the changes in Catholicism that happened throughout the 11th and 12th century are a fascinating story for another video. But anyway, now in the 21st century, we recognize autism and neurodivergent traits, and we definitely have a broader communal awareness of what it all is. But what about 1,000 years ago? I'm so glad you asked. The Middle Ages were weirdly progressive in some ways, and if you look through contemporary chronicles, you can find some remarkably compassionate, systemic frameworks for handling what we would now call neurodivergence. Let's talk about the town of Geel, you know, the 13th century community care haven. It's definitely not the first thing you think of when you hear the word medieval, but maybe it should be. Damn, somebody's dog is going crazy. I think having a dog in an apartment complex is cruel. Like, these are studio apartments. Dogs need a backyard. Anyway. Geel was a town in modern-day Belgium, and it was basically the gold standard for community-based care in the 1200s. According to local history, and my Catholics out there are probably already familiar with this, an Irish princess named Dymphna was murdered there by her crazy dad, and her burial site became associated with miraculous healing of madness and pretty much any other cognitive conditions. Nowadays, Saint Dymphna is the patron saint of everything related to mental health, and I think we need her intercession now more than ever. Anyway, this holy history turned Geel into a pilgrimage site, and pilgrims from all over Europe flooded to this tiny village that was pretty soon completely overwhelmed. In response, the local church, aptly named St. Dymphna's Church, had to build a room to house all of these people, but even that filled up super quickly and there were still more people coming. But the good folks of Geel, instead of just turning away all the surplus pilgrims, actually absorbed them into their homes. Wow, I mean, these folks were the Geel deal. This was true Christianity on display. Over the course of a few years, there was a border system that developed, and local farming families took these pilgrims in as boarders or foster family members. Now keep in mind the kind of people that would be making a pilgrimage to St. Dymphna's Church. These were people who were suffering from some kind of mental or emotional condition, whether it was autism or something else. The families who took them in allowed them to live and eat and work alongside the members of the household. Some written accounts record that if a boarder started shouting unprovoked, like a Nicholas of Trani situation, or exhibited repetitive behaviors or self-isolated, the community's explicit policy was to ignore the strange behavior whenever possible and give as much leeway as they could for what they called impairments. This system passed down through generations of Geel citizens, and it was so successful that it actually survived the Middle Ages entirely intact. It transitioned into a modernized version with psychiatric backing in the 19th century and remains an active, internationally praised model of care today. Maybe there's a lesson we can learn from the citizens of Geel about compassion and open-mindedness. But let's put the finishing touches in this medieval masterpiece. As always, we've got to challenge our chronological snobbery. No, people in the Middle Ages didn't have terms like autism or echolalia, but just look at the village of Gil that did a better job of organically absorbing and protecting their neurodivergent neighbors than most modern industrial societies. Also, before modern capitalism, a person's value wasn't entirely tethered to their efficiency at their 9-to-5 job or whatever corporate social script they're supposed to be following. Medieval society accommodated the brain to fit the environment instead of forcing the brain to bend to the machine. Also, the spectrum existed then just like it exists now. Neurodivergence in the Middle Ages isn't just one thing we can point to and say, see, you have the vulnerable ones like Brother Juniper, the hyper-focused forces of personality like Bernard of Clairvaux, and then the incredible genius visionary polymaths like Hildegard, because there are tons of others that have been lost to time. Basically what I want to say is that neurology is ancient, our brains are basically the same as they